professional. So, Sandeep, absolutely great to have you on this episode of Leadership Bites. Welcome.
Thank you, Guy. It's very kind of you to have me on your show.
Well, very much looking forward to the conversation that I believe we're about to have. And just to introduce yourself to the audience, because as I always say, I know who you are. It'd be great to just get an introduction from yourself.
Well, I'm 65. I'm an electrical engineer and turned into a business manager who had the fortune of working with different companies. And the one thing that I wanted to do was to actually play cricket, and I was just not good enough.
That's fantastic. The boyhood dream. So I saw lots of Bruce Lee movies and wanted to be a full-time martial arts instructor, but then recognized that it didn't make a lot of money. So we've all gone down certain avenues for certain reasons. So I am really fascinated by people's history and what has taken them to the present day. And I'm a firm believer that what it is that somebody has to say today has maybe more clarity and more context if you know the journey that somebody's been on. So I would love to get that sense of what has been your journey to get here today.
Yeah, thank you. All my life I've been a risk taker. My first love in life was mathematics, and my parents allowed me to pursue that dream. And I went ahead and got a PhD in electrical engineering. But after a few years of doing research, I found I didn't really know the products I researched. So at the first opportunity, I volunteered to go and become someone who actually built products. And that led slowly to me actually becoming head of R&D at my company, and then they entrusted me to run the business. A few years later, I decided, okay, now that I've run businesses, why don't I volunteer for broken businesses? And really tough assignments to see if I could do that. And so I went ahead and I got a number of opportunities to actually work with businesses that needed to be transformed. A few years later, I said, okay, now armed with this, why don't I basically go and start my own consulting company and work with other companies to help them? So I have an outside-in view rather than an inside-out view. And that, after a successful stint at that, I got back into the business of growing, companies that actually were not making a lot of money. And finally, at the final stage of my career, I decided to write a book and also go back into the startup world, which is completely different from being in a big company. So that's my history.
And it would be great just to, because I do know some of the names of the companies that you've worked for, it'd be great just to get a sense of maybe the roles that you've held in some of those organizations. Because again, what I would like the audience to do is to have a clarity and a comfort as to when we speak about some of the things we're going to speak about, what level that's coming from. So just some of the organizations you've worked for, some of the roles that you've held, just to give us context.
Yeah, thank you. My first senior role was as a general manager of Ericsson's mobile phone business for North and South America, and also sold products into Australia and New Zealand. And then that transformed into me becoming the chief technical officer of Ericsson mobile phones. And then Ericsson and Sony merged to form Sony Ericsson, and I was their first chief technical officer. And that led, to me basically working with multimedia phones. Actually, we came up with that concept way back in 2001. But there was a company that had to build the chips and software for Sony Ericsson, and they were not doing very well. So both Sony and Ericsson decided to send me to Sweden to go and rebuild that company. It was called Ericsson Mobile Platforms. They were very much like Qualcomm, building chips and software for phones. So I ran that as president. We fixed the company in 9 months. and it grew to basically at its peak to taking 30% market share in the world. After 3 years in Sweden, I came back to America to run. I couldn't stay, I was an expat. So I came back to America and I ran Freescale's wireless business. And I was the general manager of the Freescale wireless business. And Freescale was ultimately sold for $17 billion to a bunch of private equity investors. Later on, I started my consulting business, as I said earlier. And one of the last assignment I did was to help with BlackBerry. And I was the president of BlackBerry Technology Solutions, which was 5 small businesses. And I grew that from relatively insignificant revenue and profit into something more substantial thanks to my wonderful teams. And today, I am the chief operating officer of a disruptive startup, a very advanced startup doing digital radar for autonomous cars.
Thank you. And I think I appreciate the fact that you, with great humility, hesitated to or didn't offer those job titles at the start, but I think it's very worthwhile understanding them. So your book, Your Company is Your Castle. As an author of a book, I recognize that I sat there for a long time going, what am I going to call this? So I wonder, did you have a working title from the start and knew where you were going, or did the title of the book come to you, at the end? In essence, what does it mean, and why did you choose that title?
Yeah, that's a great question, because originally I didn't think of the title. I wrote the book and I sent it out for review, and several editors and my agent, they all basically suggested that I needed a more catchy title. And my whole premise of writing the book was to say that you need to build a company very similar to a medieval castle that has lasted several hundred years. Medieval castles have withstood invaders and have withstood nature's elements for a long time. And what made them last? Similarly, a company has to withstand macroeconomic factors like depressions, recessions, wars, pandemics, and they have to withstand competitors, very similar to the invaders of a castle. And so I felt that that analogy or extended metaphor would be very appropriate, and that is how I call the castle that's how I came up with the title.
And I notice it's built on 8 structural elements, and not necessarily that I don't want to launch into a training session, but just give us a sense of, when somebody reads the book, what is it that you want them to take away from having read it?
Yeah, that is probably the hardest question I had to answer myself when I wrote the book, because I actually revised it 51 times over 3 years. So I'm actually quite adept at getting feedback. Initially, I get upset, but then I say, actually, I should basically listen to my readers. And essentially, I wrote it for those who want to learn, who aspire to learn about running a business and leading a business. And so what are the elements that go into building a business? Because when I was a general manager at about 38 or 39 years old, I was running a very big business, and I made horrible mistakes because I was adept technically. I had a management diploma, but I was adept technically, I was adept operationally, but I really didn't understand business. And I made a ton of mistakes. But every stumbling block became a stepping stone for success. So I said, what if I capture all of that in a structured, systematic manner and impart what I learned to others so that they may use it to build a better business and build themselves without falling into the traps that I did.
It's a great phrase, that, or statement. Every stumbling block becomes a step to success. So even though I've got a whole host of questions, I'm just going to pick up on that and just ask that relationship with failure. Well, failure would be the wrong word for something not going as you planned it to. Is very interesting. Somebody once said to me, I've realised, Guy, because I do leadership development, as I'm sure you know, is I rob people of their experiences. And I said, what do you mean when you say that? And he said, well, pre-internet, there seemed to be a buffer between things going wrong and people finding out about it. So I often had 48 hours to even a week that I or my team or something had gone wrong, we would learn from it, we'd put it right, and by the time the conversation came up, we'd already made strides. But now people know about it within the hour. Everybody's straight on to you, what's happening. So actually, I end up micromanaging or not even allowing people the room to grow that I had because of that fear of just the rapidity of what's going to happen next. So every stumbling block becomes a step to success, gives me a sense of embracing the learning, etc. And I just wonder how you dealt with when things went wrong.
Yeah, there are two things, right, that I learned on this journey. And the first is, how to constantly deal with getting out of your comfort zone. Like I said, I began with being a researcher. And then when I moved over to product development, I didn't have the same expertise. And I was not really someone who was as respected as I was a researcher. And I always said that it takes a little getting used to being the runt in the litter. You first have to basically realign your mindset and adapt. And I used to get up every day at 4 o'clock in the morning and read about my new area before I went to work. And I would deconstruct products all through the day and weekends. And I would learn from anyone I could. And in a couple of years, I became quite adept at what I did. And that became the formula to actually repeatedly do things. One of my favorite quotes is from Benjamin Disraeli. And it says, success is a product of unremitting attention to purpose. And so that's the first part. The second part is you have to basically learn to deal with adversity. A professor friend of mine taught me something really invaluable. I remember I was very upset because something bad had happened at work, and I took it as my own failure. And he came to me and he said, Sandeep, look, if you are someone who has one sandwich on their plate and somebody took it from you, you should be upset. But you're someone who has a lot of sandwiches on his plate. So if somebody took one, why do you care? Look forward, don't look back. And I've used these two principles to actually go forward. And there's one more very important quote that has helped me in my journey, and I quote it everywhere. And that's from Bertrand Russell. And it said, conquering fear is the first step to wisdom.
Yes. So when I hear that, is that the fear of judgment, the fear of one's own vanity, the fear of feeling vulnerable, all of the above? What does that mean to you?
To me, it's the fear of failing. You cannot basically let that stop you. And this is where this unremitting attention to purpose matters. There are a number of things, whether it was research, or it was a product, or it was turning something around. Yes, I tried and I failed, but I tried something else. And you keep trying till you fix it. But if you're afraid that you got a failing grade, you won't try again. And you have to constantly believe, you have to have that conviction that you will succeed.
So something there about, your vulnerability not making you vulnerable, and true strength coming from the willingness to have a level of vulnerability so you can learn and grow, if I've understood you correctly.
That's correct, because your resilience comes from how many times can you get knocked down and rise, and that is where your resilience comes from, right? And so that's something that I have embraced for a long time. It takes some time, because the first couple of times you get knocked down, you wonder, you have really serious doubt. But with time, you actually have to basically steel yourself and believe that you can do something. And whenever I have tried, I remember there was once a problem, a technical problem. A very famous professor from a very, very famous university had said it was mathematically intractable. And I worked on it for 5 years. And then one day I was actually, my wife was doing her master's in mathematics. And she asked me to explain something to her. And while I I realized that the solution to this problem was 10th standard mathematics. I was thinking about it completely wrong for 5 years. So I went back to my lab, and true enough, it was an easy solution. So, you've got to keep trying, and you have to believe that you can do something and solve things, even if others tell you it can't be done.
That kind of leads me, I'm looking at some of the chapters in your book, and that kind of leads me to this be a first mover as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I hazard a guess as to what we're going to talk about with that, but it would also indicate that if you fear, the chances are you're not going to be a first mover. So, but being a first mover as often as possible in the context of the book, what is that referring to?
Yeah, actually, I talk about how you basically build creative products, right? And, normally these products haven't been designed. And I have a great story actually here. I remember that when I first, I was at Sony Ericsson. We had, our revenue was started off around 6 billion, and we rapidly dropped to about 3.5, 4 billion. And we were losing to a much bigger competitor, Nokia, who had a better brand. They had brilliant execution. They had wonderful distribution channels, and they were creative. And they had a cost structure that we could not match. So we had to come up with something about how do we basically reinvent ourselves and win against this very formidable competitor. And so I remember proposing how to build multimedia phones. I said, we've got to basically, I think people want to listen to music on phones. They want to take pictures. They want color displays. They want to basically play games. They want the access to the internet. And we have to completely redesign our platform, chips and software to do this. And I remember in this meeting, in this committee meeting, everyone said, you're nuts. Because look at what Nokia is doing. We should be doing things like them. And I remember my boss telling everyone, and I recognize him in the book, and he said, why do we have a CTO if we're not going to listen to him? And so they gave me the charter to go build that. And, I think, that's an example of, even though everyone basically thought it wasn't a good idea at that time, I think soon when we started creating it, I think everyone got on board. And guess what? They were the ones, not me, who actually launched the product and took the company from 4 billion to close to 12 billion. So
I don't know the timelines there. Talking about Nokia, there's a fantastic, I think it's Forbes magazine, and on the front there's a picture of a gentleman looking in profile with a Nokia phone, and it says, "Will anybody ever catch the mobile phone king?" Something along those lines, referring to Nokia. And I use that in certain situations to say, hands up, who has a Nokia? Of course, nobody's got a Nokia. So, the king is dead, long live the king, right? Things change and things adapt. So when you said multimedia, was that pre the Apple phones?
Yes.
Just what was the timeline there?
That was around 2001, 2. And we basically actually started launching stuff in 2004. So it took about 2 to 3 years to actually get the platform out, and started to get our Sony Ericsson phones to be more widely accepted because they had these capabilities. Now everyone else followed. But there's another story I tell in my book. And I used to meet my boss, who was very creative. His name is Katsumi Ihara-san. And he used to live in England. And we'd meet in London regularly at coffee shops or for dinner. And we'd talk about products. And after we'd come up with this initial concept, we had launched a very creative phone called the P900. It was a full screen phone, but the only problem was you had to click on the icons with a pen or a stylus. And Ihara-san told me, he said, Sandeep, you know what? The entire industry is going to be revolutionized by someone who simplifies the user interface. He said, today, using scrolling wheels, keypads, pens, this is not the way people want to use phones. They need to use their hands and fingers. And he said, make this a touchscreen phone and make it thinner, which is exactly what the iPhone was, So way back in 2003, he had this vision. And for some reason, our business decided to discontinue that line. And I've regretted it ever since. So I remember a few years later, I actually got onto a talk show with a very famous New York talk show host. And he asked me in this big forum, hey, Sandeep, you seem to be a guy who knows about phones. What do you think is the next killer app? And I told him the user interface, remembering Ihara-san's wise words. 6 months later, Steve Jobs launched the iPhone, and the rest is history.
Boom. It's interesting, isn't it, when you hear that something was rejected or shut down, like the Beatles, a phenomenon in the music industry, rejected by somebody who said, "Oh, there's we don't need any more guitar bands anymore." Or, that kind of thing. It seems like absolute common sense until somebody goes and turns it into the next phenomenon. So that kind of brings me on to a lot of companies fail. There are a lot of organizations that you see in lists of the best companies in the world, and you go back a decade later and, they're not necessarily there. I mean, I know that sometimes they're being acquired or integrated, but, they come and they go. So what's your sense of why, taking out very particular reasons, but in the round, why do companies fail?
So, I state very early in the book that 2/3 of all companies fail within 10 years. And, it's actually an interesting statistic that about 20% of them fail in 2 years, 45% in 5 years, and 65% in 10 years. And quite simply, in my experience, having consulted for companies, run companies, so, in the 10 or so companies that I've been associated with and evaluated, in addition to the ones that I was involved with, I think it's because they opt for speed versus structure. And, there's always this urgency to do things quickly. Somehow we seem to want to do things quickly, but we always, and not right, but we have time to do it again. But if you build a company systematically and structurally with all the elements, that's how it can grow. Because, before you set up the walls of a castle, the curtain wall of a castle, you need a solid foundation, right? Without systematically building this castle, you wouldn't have a castle that lasted very long. So I believe it is the systematic structure that needs to be set up in order to basically make a company thrive.
And that speed versus structure, it's quite interesting because maybe it's not just in technology, I'm sure, but first to market sometimes, whereas first to market, even if it doesn't work that well, it doesn't matter because we'll be the one that is imprinted maybe on the customer's mind. Therefore, we can kind of repair it as we go, but we'll have possibly dominated the market just by people's kind of experience of us, as long as it's not fundamentally flawed and they hate us. So there's a balance, is there, where organizations like Apple seem to wait to let things settle before they decide what to do, and then some organizations rush to get it out. And I've just seen Google, in response to ChatGPT, they seem to have, well, the commentary is that they've rushed out their response to it as a kind of fear response. So is that a constant battle, that getting something into the world so actually it gets ahead of the game versus, no, let's not put it out until it's ready?
I mean, I agree. Timing is everything. It's like a train coming to a station. There's certain opportunities. If the train goes and you're standing on the platform after it leaves, hey, it's over. So that's the conundrum that a lot of managers face. But I think there's much more. Apple's a really good example of how things are done really well. They think through how to basically launch products, because it's not just having a cool product and being there first. Does it work well? Does it have the quality? Does it give the customer the experience and the wow factor? Does it create stickiness that you want to use it, and in the face of competition, you wouldn't leave them? What are your marketing channels? What are your distribution channels? How do you basically build all of that? What are your supply chains in order to deliver the product if there is a serious demand? Because all of this goes towards fulfilling an experience. And one has to think through all these factors before you can actually make a product successful. And this is why I basically talk about these 8 structural elements that go to building both growth and profitability in a business.
So when you're looking at an organization, you've had an illustrious career. And if somebody pulled you to one side at a social gathering and said, Sandeep, I know that context is king, but just, I'm looking to start my own business. No, let me correct that, actually. My business has gone wrong. Because starting out with a new business it's green pastures, isn't it? But my business has gone wrong. Might be culturally we've lost our way, or we can't find a product that the market seems to engage with, or whatever it is. There might be a million things. But what is your formula for looking at an organization that's lost its way, wherever that might be, and bringing it back on track?
Oh, that's a great question. It's actually a very hard question because every situation is so different. But, being a consultant, I go in and it's the same framework that I talk about in my book. I talk about these 8 structural elements, and there are a few more factors, but I look at them in that framework and find out which of the structural elements was the most damaged or is the most damaged. And can you rectify it in any reasonable time with a reasonable amount of money? Because till you have addressed that and you have a compelling recovery, no one's going to give you money. And sometimes I've come to the conclusion that it's not rescuable, and my recommendation is find the best exit. And that happens quite often. You cannot keep kidding yourself and keep reinventing something that's broken. unless you actually get to the root cause and figure out, hey, what am I going to do about this?
And when we talk about those essential elements, that's financial health, strategy, culture, products, sales channels, execution, and stakeholder confidence. I've got that right, haven't I?
That's correct.
And would it be right to say that when you write something down, you have to write it in order, but actually those, no one is more important than the other? Or, well, actually, Guy, if I was going to say start with, the first two or three, is there an order to this? Or actually, no, that they have an equality?
No, I actually have them in the order that I would go about that it's in priority order, because I believe that without cash, you can't do much, right? And if you don't have cash, and that's the foundation. If you don't have cash and a good business model that's sticky, how is your strategy ever going to work, right? Once you've defined a strategy, I've maintained that strategy is what you want to get done, but culture is what you actually get done. So when culture and strategy clash, culture always wins. Peter Drucker said that, not me. And how do you basically align culture to execute to your strategy? And that's a very important part. It's both changing behaviors and beliefs and actions in a company, as well as how you lead that change. And then you have to define good products. And there's a whole series of steps. It's just to prevent the missteps. Every product is unique, and there's no one formula, but you can do a number of things to avoid, common mistakes. And then how do you deliver these products? Do they have the right quality? Do they have the right cost? Are they delivered on time to hit market windows? And then you've got to build sales channels, because I call them the pipes of sustenance, because that's what brings in revenue. Right? And how do you build that? How do you systematically, and sales is much more complex than just going and pushing a product in the market. It's a whole host of things that I talk about. And then finally, you need stakeholder confidence, because stakeholders are your investors, your customers, and your employees. Investors give you money to do good things. Customers pay you for doing good things. And employees actually help you do good things. So without the confidence of these three, I don't think you could have a good company. And then once you've done all of this and built your company, how do you build yourself? I have 7 beliefs on how you should lead that company. And that's really the essence of the entire book.
So I'm fascinated by a couple of things. One of them that I do need to talk about, because when I saw it, I go, oh. It's like when I spoke to Dave Ulrich, who's renowned HR guru, or maybe he wouldn't like that word, so guru, but I think he's written something like 30 books, and I was like, that's just ridiculous. Well, it's not ridiculous; it's brilliant. And of course, I ended up saying,
absolutely.
And I kind of said to him, I have a sneaky suspicion that while I'm watching television, you're actually writing a book. As in, he's more active than I am. Of course he is. You have 180 patents, which I think requires some discussion. First of all, when did you have time? Between doing everything else. But out of 180 patents or patents, depending on where we are in the world, which are the ones that have the most value for you?
Oh, that's an easy answer. My 2 best inventions are my 2 children.
Okay.
People have asked me this, and I always say that because it made me proud, and that's really it. But the thing is, inventions. There's something about inventions that I want to mention. Inventions, success. No one achieves that by themselves. If I was able to invent, if I was able to turn around companies, if I was able to launch groundbreaking products, it was solely because of my teams. I can't take credit for it. Yes, did I lead them? Yes. Did I listen? Yes. Sometimes I didn't. I probably frustrated them many times by being dogmatic and not responsive. But in the end, it is their credit. It is to their credit that all this happened. And that's why in my book I credit. I've actually dedicated the book to my wife of 33 years, and she's been very inspirational to me and influential, but also to all the people who worked with me, whether they were bosses, peers, employees, customers, partners. Every one of them influenced me. And this book is as much theirs as mine.
So, out of the 180 patents that aren't children, which are the ones that stand out to you the most?
I mean, they're all very different because I've had patents in wireless technology, cellular phones, in GPS, in security, in software, and in semiconductors, in a very wide variety. But I think that the most useful ones then were I came up with something for police radios in 1988. Police cars had to go from one territory to another or one region to another, and they can never lose the signal because they have to be in constant communication with with headquarters or whoever is managing communications, the communication center. And, but when you leave a region, you lose cell coverage. So I created this thing called automatic simulcast alignment, which was, it's a very long name, but basically I said if you broadcast the signal from two towers, the tower that you're in, the region you're in, and the one that you're going towards, and somehow combine the signals in the police radio so that you always have a connection. So it was in the form, it was called make versus break. You never broke the connection. You had two connections and you just picked the strongest in your phone and you kept communication. That I think was later, that same concept has been used extensively in cellular technology. So that was one. Another one that I was very proud of actually is that there was a very hard problem in wireless communication where when you had a phone and you turned it on and you had to basically talk to the base station like you wanted to make a call. The base station did not know where you were, so it could not locate you. So I had to create a system that it would automatically connect to the base station and the base station would find it easy to lock onto you. And I created a very simple algorithm that actually finally got used. So I thought that was extremely useful because that's how we make calls. And there are a couple of others that others actually, they think that it's really useful, like the universal audio jack. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm the first inventor, but I've got a patent on it. Maybe I was. Who knows?
I love the fact that my 10-year-old just turns stuff on, and it's just he has no idea of the anxiety that we used to have, through the various iterations of getting to where we are today.
I've got a really great story on that. Many years ago, my daughter was 3 years old, and my boss had come in, and there was a big debate in Ericsson at that time. All the product management guys wanted a big button that said turn on and off. And we had actually made it much simpler by having a dual function button. It did many things. So this debate raged on. The engineering was getting hammered by product management to say, no, we need this big button that says on and off because people don't know how to turn our phones on. So my boss was in my house and we had a phone on the table and my little daughter comes in. She's only 3 years old. She picks up the phone and perfectly turns it on. Okay. And so my boss said, we don't need a big red button. If this 3-year-old knows how to do it, we don't need a button.
That's perfect. And do you know what? My other son, he's 8.5 now. He has autism, and he deals with things just like, it's very interesting to see him do stuff, which is he'll press every single button until what he wants to happen happens. Yeah. And then he'll just remember what he did.
Exactly.
And then he'll come along and he'll pick something up and he'll utilize it. And you go, when did he learn how to do that? Well, what you didn't see was him sitting there for 15 minutes, just hitting absolutely everything. And they're going, right, I've got it. And they, we learn from trial and error. I love that story. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Because she didn't just pick it up and get it. She'd been hammering away on those keys until she eventually went, right, that's how you turn it on and get it.
I'm pretty sure exactly how children learn,
I love that. So just, I guess, not so much as we come to a close, but as we kind of get to the back end of this conversation, because I say I have amazing guests, and I could just, if I lived down the road, you'd never get rid of me. I'd just be a permanent guest in at your dinner table. And you go, this fella, I only did one podcast with him. He's going to have to leave at some point, So that would be, when you've lived a life of commercial input and being present in organizations with all the politic and the posturing and the people and all the things that go with it. For somebody, because we have an audience of seasoned practitioners through to people that are probably starting out or just trying to figure their way through things. So somebody just thinking, I want to be a success. Doesn't matter what I'm doing. I want to be a success in a commercial space. Are there any top tips?
Yeah, I have three things that have guided me, and three very core principles. The first is, anything you do with conviction. Don't do it half-heartedly. Okay? Be absolutely convinced that what you're doing is right. The story I tell, and I've said this so many times in many podcasts and in my book, is that in 1984, I wanted to get into mobile phones. Everyone told me, you're nuts. There's a big consulting company that said there are only 1 million phones going to be sold by 2000. And by the way, today phones are huge. They're strapped on people's backs. And I said, no, guys, this is going to change. As all technology changes, it's going to be the future of communications. And I went on to do a PhD, and I've never regretted that decision. Despite a lot of people who influenced me said, change. The second thing is, when you run any business, right, you must have managerial courage. It's not physical courage. It is do what is right. Don't do anything based on who you know or who people know, but what they know. Treat everything based on the merit of the argument. And, leave your friendship badge at the door when you enter the building. By being fair, you get a very balanced way of running a business. People may not like you, but you will not basically be influenced easily to do wrong things. And the third is focus. Every morning I get up, I have a very simple routine. And I get up at 5, I drink 2 cups of coffee, and I do a British cryptic crossword. And I try to get on the leaderboard. That's my little competitive stuff. After that, I sit down and I think, what am I going to do today? Right? I compartmentalize my day, right? And I try to make sure that I'm adding, at the end of the day, I ask myself, can I qualify my contributions today? Right? Every day, can you qualify what you did? And that's how I've run my life, and if I feel I'm on the wrong track, I'm immediately correcting because I'm doing this every day. And I think that that's what's helped me. I'm sure there are better ways to do things, and I'm constantly learning. But, as the last of my favorite quotes is from Lord Thomas Dewar. He said, minds are like parachutes. They only function when open.
That's great. So my last question then is, somebody says, Sandeep, what should I listen to or read? Is there a podcast I should listen to? Is there a book that I should read that would help me in my future, in my growth, in my development as I move forward in the world? What would you offer?
That's a really deep question. I'm reminded of a Jesuit priest from my school days. I went to a Catholic school in India. It was called St. Joseph's Boys High School. And this priest was very influential. He was very tough, but he was very influential in my thinking. He asked me, Sandeep, it's your choice to be ignorant or not. So, and that stuck with me. So what I do every day is, when I talk to people, when I listen, when I read, whatever I do, I jot down in a little notebook things that I never heard before, I don't know about. You don't have to be an expert on everything, but you can say, somebody talks to me about a financial concept, right? Convertible notes or convertible bonds. Some financial guy told me about that. Somebody else talks to me about something else, option trading or whatever, right? I make it a point to keep these notes of what I don't know. And sometime during the week, I go and look them up. And I try to understand, because in my experience, it's better to basically ask questions, look up things, get knowledge, because knowledge is very powerful when used appropriately. I've found that knowledge and attitude breaks down all barriers to enhancement or in your career.
That's perfect, Sandeep. Thank you. So I'm going to bring us to a close. I'm going to get you just to stay on for a few moments just to make sure everything loads up as it should do, because you don't want me to call you back and going, we've got to do that again. That'd be the worst call I'd have to make. So just from me, from the people that are listening, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. It's been a pleasure. And thank you again.